This is the Cambridge Roundtable on Political Biographies, part of the 3-day workshop on politico-intellectual histories of 20th century India. This panel would broadly revolve around an engagement with life writing, but also doing history in public. I will briefly introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. Jairam Ramesh, an Indian parliamentarian belonging to the Indian National Congress. He is a member of parliament representing Karnataka in the Rajya Sabha. July 2011, Jairam Ramesh was appointed Minister of Rural Development and Minister Additional in charge of the new Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. Prior to that, he was the Indian Minister of State Independent Charge at the Ministry of Environment and Forest from May 2009 to July 2011. He has written extensively on modern and contemporary Indian politics. Among his other writings, the biographies he has authored include Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, Intertwined Lives, P.N. Haksar and Indira Gandhi, A Chequered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon. Akshita?
Let me go ahead and introduce Mr. A.S. Panneerselvan. He is the Reader's Editor at The Hindu and Executive Director of Panos South Asia. Huge presence. It's got a presence in 5 countries, works in 3 more with the help of local consultants as well. Mr. Panneerselvan is also a steering committee member of the Global Forum for Media Development, also an advisory panel member of the Knight International Journalism Fellowship Program that's administered by the ICFJ. So Mr. Panneerselvan, apart from being a regular columnist, is also a journalism teacher. He's an adjunct faculty member of course, I'm sure all of you have heard of the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. His biography of DMK patriarch, the late Karunanidhi, has also been widely appreciated. Rohit, let me just introduce our third guest, and then I'll hand it back to you. We've got Mr. Kannan also with us. He is a child of the Dravidian movement. He's long been a commentator on Dravidian politics, raised, educated at Chennai, quite like me. Kannan has completed his LLM from the University of Georgia and PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Tufts University. Mr. Kannan has also served in various capacities with the United Nations in 2 continents for nearly a quarter of a century. He presently heads the Basra office of the UN Assistant Mission for Iraq. His biographies, of course, on CN Annadurai, on Dr. MGR have been key texts to really understand Dravidian politics for so many of us.
Our final panelist is Vaibhav Purandare. Mr. Purandare began his journalistic career with the political magazine Blitz in 1993. In the early years, Thackeray and his organization played a key role in the Mumbai riots. It was during these years that were formative for him, and he since worked with India's leading newspapers such as the Indian Express, the Asian Age, Daily News and Analysis DNA, Midday and Mumbai Mirror. Apart from writing for a host of other publications during the same time, Vaibhav is currently senior editor with the Times of India and is widely known for his 2 biographies on Bal Thackeray and Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. The title of his books are Bal Thackeray and the Rise of the Shiv Sena and Savarkar, the True Story of the Father of Hindutva. I'll also introduce our moderator, Akshita Nandgopal. She's an associate editor and anchor with India Today. She has many years of experience covering contemporary politics, especially Dravidian politicking and electioneering. In this election season, Akshita happened to travel across Tamil Nadu to cover the mood on the ground. She's also covered every major political turning point lately in the state, from former CM Jayalalitha's demise to the political fallout of her death, the Jallikattu protests, and also Karunanidhi's demise.
Thank you very much, Rohit. So let me extend the same courtesy. Let me introduce Rohit also to all of our panelists and to everyone who's joined us on this. Rohit Datta Roy is a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge. Before joining Cambridge as a Cambridge International Trust Scholar, he had completed an MPhil in Modern History from the Center for Historical Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, first-class Masters in History from the University of Delhi, and first-class BA and MA degrees in Comparative Literature from the Jadavpur University. So as a historian of modern South Asia, Rohit's focus essentially has been on everyday politics and how really it informs intellectual exchanges, electoral formulations, identity formulations, as well as governmentality. So Rohit, we're done with the formalities. Shall we begin?
Yes. So let's begin. Do you want to begin with a question, or should I set the tone with a generic question of sorts? Are you okay with that?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so let me start with a generic question, allow the session to warm up of sorts and people to come in. I can still see people joining. So let me first begin with a generic question. what led to the choice of characters? When you are picking the person or choosing somebody that you want to write a biography of, are you specifically looking for a lacuna in the field? We were just discussing Kamraj. So are you like thinking whether there's a dearth of biographies on this political figure? Or, and this is very interesting because we'll probably come back on this later, or are you specifically thinking that this is a person whose politics I can sort of identify with? To use a more common Hindi belt term, that I sort of belong to this schema, even if not actively, but maybe ideologically or intellectually. So let's set the tone with that question. We can begin with Mr. Ramesh, followed by the order that we introduced our panelists.
Well, I have three criteria, Rohit. One, the subject should be consequential. He or she must have had some impact. Number two, that there must be a significant body of contemporaneous primary archival material relating to the subject of the biography. And number three, I must have some, empathy. I must have some streak of admiration and respect for the subject that I'm writing about. So I set out to writing. I'm not a neutral person when I set out to write, but I make it a point to be objective. So these are my criteria: being consequential, having a significant body of contemporary primary archival material, and three, somebody I relate to as a person and as a public figure.
Okay, sure.
Mr. Panneerselvan, would you like to give in your opening comments?
In my case, my interest with Mr. Karunanidhi started with a simple fact that he has been the most prolific writer, and yet he was not fully understood by non-Tamils. Actually, he has written more than 3 lakh pages.
Yeah.
Somebody who has been so articulate and who has expressed himself in an unambiguous manner, why has he not been understood clearly by others? This is not only about non-Tamil, it's also about the Tamils of the Sri Lanka. It's also about the Indian left. Therefore, if you actually, my idea is to understand on what basis he took certain crucial decisions. And there are 3 people who have been extremely critical of him initially and who actually changed their opinion much later. For instance, Mr. Jairam. Jairam came up with stringent criticism of Karunanidhi. And much later, he says that his criticisms are extremely wrongly placed. Therefore, I also wanted to map these changes. And I also wanted to understand how somebody's idea of public sphere is dominated by both Agam and Puram, that is the interior ideas as well as your external political positions. Therefore, that balance between Agam and Puram is the one which keeps coming up. And therefore, it becomes extremely fascinating for me. And as a journalist, when I came into journalism, he was in the opposition. And for journalists, nobody is a better friend than the leaders in the opposition because they have time to spend with you and they are also willing to open up their mind. Therefore, when I became a journalist in 85, and from 85 to 89, he was in the opposition, which means it was easier to interact with a political leader when they are in the opposition, and it opens up a space in a way it never opens up when they are in power, because when they are in power, I don't think they can afford to spend that much of time with media people. This extended interaction between 84 and 89 in many ways helped to shape my perception of how to look at him. And this also comes into play much later, after 1991. In 1991, when India opened up and when Soviet Union collapsed, he wrote a series of essays in Murasulu.
I think someone's entered the meeting. Request anyone who enters the meeting to please mute your mics so that we can have our panelists please speak. I think it's fine now, Mr. Panneerselvan. Go ahead. Sorry.
It's essentially the interest to know on what basis certain decisions were taken. my idea is to understand both Tamil Nadu's political history as well as certain crucial decisions which are taken over a period of time. On what basis those decisions were taken, instead of making a value judgment on it. Over to you, Rohit.
Mr. Kannan?
I would go with two of Mr. Ramesh's criteria, which is except the archival material. I think, like Kamraj, many of these leaders do not have a lot of archival material, but in the case of uh, how consequential they've been, both these leaders that I chose were very extremely consequential people who had served Tamil Nadu very well. But their interests have not been served outside Tamil Nadu and outside the Tamil-speaking populace. So the other criteria that I wanted to look at is where I could come in, and if there was a need. For instance, I would not be interested in writing a biography of Indira Gandhi. Firstly, there are tens of biographies available, and who am I to write about her? Nothing. But the advantage that someone like me has is that we could straddle the worlds of Tamil and English with relative ease. And there are very few of us out there, and with such an interest and with a critical eye. And most of these, firstly, there is no biography in English for many of these southern leaders. Even Rajaji, except for his son, I think, I don't think there are any other biographies. And there is plenty of archival material for Rajaji, Mr. Ramesh would know. So, in addition to them being consequential and in the fact that I should have some affinity towards them, the third was also if I could bring in, if I could plug in the void that was there. This was mostly geared towards people like my children who could not read Tamil, but would have to understand what had happened in this place with the instrument of English. So that's the idea.
Vaibhav, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. So some 10 years ago, I read a piece in a national news magazine saying that Vinayak Damodar Savarkar had written several mercy petitions to the British, and he always made an attempt to hide those hide the fact that he wrote those mercy petitions to the British all his life. And the writer of that piece claimed that he had discovered all those mercy petitions. At about the same time, I read a letter written to a Marathi newspaper, a leading Marathi newspaper, by a follower of Savarkar, who said that Savarkar had never written any such mercy petitions to the British. Now, I remember distinctly reading in my school days Savarkar's most famous book, Maji Janmatep, which is about his years in the Andamans, where he had made clearly some references to certain petitions he wrote to the British. When I read these two clashing narratives, I looked up the book again and I saw that Savarkar had not only written about the petitions, but he had written about those petitions in considerable detail. So the journalist who was claiming to have unearthed those petitions was incorrect, and Savarkar's follower, who was trying to tell us that he had never written those petitions, was also incorrect. And I felt that having had access to Savarkar's original writings in Marathi, and Savarkar having suddenly become this extremely controversial figure in Indian politics as a whole, especially with the emergence of Hindutva and the emergence of Narendra Modi on the national scene in India, and the fact that Narendra Modi's actions and his government's actions were much animated by Savarkar's ideas, it was necessary to write a new biography of Savarkar. We need to understand Savarkar in order to understand India today, also to understand the thinking of the Indian government today, and equally importantly to understand a very important strand of the Indian national movement and the real story behind Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. What's the real story? He's a man of extremes and he evokes extreme reactions. But what's the truth? And which are the myths circulating about him? These were my motivations. And I thought the timing was just right because when I started work on this book about 7, 8 years ago, I realized that the last available biography in English was by Dhananjay Keer, which was written in the year of Savarkar's death, 1966. And in 1966, the year in which Savarkar died, he was a man on the fringes of Indian politics. And it was believed that he would continue to remain on the fringes of Indian politics forever. And suddenly, there has been this resurgence of Hindu nationalism, and he has become an extremely important and highly controversial figure. So it was important to look at him extremely closely, and it was the right time to do so, I felt. That's why I picked the subject.
Okay, Mr. Ramesh, my first question is to you, based on what you had said in your opening remarks. So that was one of my questions that I had planned initially. Also, when you had said that you need to have a certain connect with the person, whether it's a public figure, and you have to connect to what they agree with. But then, is there a worry for someone like you, because you're a politician yourself, that very often your book and your biography will be deemed as politically colored?
That's why I said, actually, that you have to be objective, not uh, not neutral, but you have to be objective. And you have, if you're depending on the archival material, especially, you have to be dispassionate and not sift through the material to include only the material that makes your subject out look to be too good. So in all my three biographies of Indira Gandhi or Haksar or Krishna, particularly on Krishna Menon, because Krishna Menon was a great eccentric and a very controversial character.
Yeah.
There are a lot of material which put him in negative light. And in fact, there's a lot of material which puts Nehru in a negative light. And I had to decide whether to include it or not, but I included it. Similarly, in my biography of Indira Gandhi and P.N. Haksar, the sections on the emergency, were controversial. They were bound to raise hackles. But as a biographer, see, when I wrote these three books, I was not writing them as a congressman. I was writing them as a student of Indian political history. And I drew flack from some of my friends and some of my colleagues in the party for being critical. But on the whole, I think people appreciated the fact that I was, as frank and objective as I could be. One very quick point I want to make on what Mr. Kannan and what Vaibhav have said. The unique advantage of Vaibhav and Mr. Kannan and Panneerselvan is they straddle two languages. They actually look at regional sources. In the case of Vaibhav, it was Marathi source, and in the case of Panneerselvan and Mr. Kannan, is the Tamil sources. In my case, of course, these three subjects were all national figures, and by and large, 99% of the material was in the English language. But I think in terms of writing political biographies in India, there is a shortage of biographers who depend on regional language sources, archival sources, newspaper sources. I think that's a big lacuna. And that's why in India, you have a number of political biographies of so-called national figures. But you do not have enough biographies of what James Menon many years called regional progressives. Certainly Mr. Annadurai was a great regional. For example, there is no great biography of Devraj Urs or Bhairon Singh Shekhawat. I would argue that even Y.B. Chavan, there is no great biography of Y.B. But there are a large number of Indian political personalities for whom the material is in the local language. And that has deterred the writing of biography writing in the English language. And I'm glad one of the unique advantages of Vaibhav, there have been so many books on Savarkar, but Vaibhav's is the only one which really looks at Marathi language sources and Marathi archives, which tell a completely different story of Savarkar than what the English language archives will make you out. So you have to be objective when you write these biographies. You have to be absolutely dispassionate, uh, and you have to put yourself at a slight distance. And also, Akshata, I would end by saying that to me, biography writing is about writing narratives. It's not about judging people. Unfortunately, in our country, we either demonize somebody or we valorize somebody. When we write books, we make
We
them out either
editorialize biographies.
or villains. So biography means by nature bringing out the person in totality.
Rohit, you want to come in?
Yes, yes. Taking the argument forward from where Akshita left and the question she asked you, first let me register my protest because there is one Bengali, there is one Marathi, and three Tamilians here. That these are regional figures, and only if you have ruled from Delhi, then you become a national figure. Let me register a protest on that bit at least, but also continue with the other issues. So let me begin by a contentious question. Actually, you said that when you wrote these biographies, you were thinking of yourself as a student of Indian political history, and you didn't want to valorize them, right? You wanted to sort of bring out all the nuances. Now, I read, all of your books when they came out, so I've been sitting down to prepare notes and questions for this when this was conceptualized. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Ramesh, I might be mistaken, do correct me, but when I was sitting down with the book that I'd read and preparing notes, especially for Indira Gandhi, I'll come to the other books later, especially for Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, is there a mention of the Idukki Dam? The Idukki Dam was actually first sanctioned under Indira Gandhi and then completed under her. We of course know about the ecological disasters that dams have wrought in modern India. Now, I specifically, even when I went back to the book now, I had read it when it came out, I couldn't find a mention of the Idukki Dam, and I think there were protests even then, miners protests then. What's your take on that? Was that sort of something which did not feature in your
Well,
narrative?
the Idukki Dam doesn't figure in my book because it was not a major milestone in Indian environmental history. But the Mathura oil refinery, which
Yes.
was a disastrous decision on the part of Indira Gandhi to locate an oil refinery 60 kilometers from the Taj Mahal in the Bharatpur bird sanctuary, has been dealt with in great detail.
Yes.
So that's one negative decision. Also, the opening up of the Western Ghats, iron ore mining in the Western Ghats, and getting the Iranians to make major investments at a time when India's forex reserves were very low. This devastated the Western Ghats ecology, and finally, the Supreme Court had to intervene and put an end to the mining in the year 2005. So these are negative examples on Indira Gandhi's track record as an environmental leader, which I have dealt with extensively, because there is, as I said, there is primary material on Idiki. Barring newspaper headlines, I really didn't have any letters or any correspondence or any file notings. So I mean that's the constraint which I have always faced when I write my books. I don't interview people when I write books. I don't depend on oral histories. I don't depend on recollections of key actors. I go entirely by primary material, and that's a constraint, because it limits what you can highlight in your biography.
No, but
Mr. Panneerselvan, would you agree? Sure, go ahead, Rohit.
just one minor interjection. I'm sorry for the. So I think as historians we do now acknowledge that newspaper reports and maybe if there were police protests around Idukki and these protests were recorded, those would also serve as biographies. I understand there would have been limitations of language perhaps, but those would also be archival material, right?
Well, I'm sorry. In my view, newspaper reports are not archival material. I mean,
Right.
they're useful reference material. They're useful reference material,
These
but
are
I don't
documented.
consider newspaper reports as archival.
Sure. So yeah, Mr. Panisa.
So, Mr. Panneerselvan, you know what Mr. Jairam Ramesh mentioned about what you go through to go ahead and write a political biography, what's considered material, what's not. Do you do interviews with people? Would you consider that to be the base? Especially when you're writing on someone like Kalainar Karunanidhi, you have to complete in one book their decades of political experience and political work. So, how do you go about that?
The biggest technique what I have to use was filtering. There were 3 volumes of the history of DMK written by Mr. Tirunavukarasu, which ends in 1969, which means actually it deals with only 20 years from 1949 to 1969, and it is 3 volumes. Kalainar himself has written about 3 lakh pages, and there is 100-volume collected works of Anna which has come out, and 66 volumes was released in the Madras Book Fair, in which Kannan also participated, and the rest of the thing has come out. Therefore, we are talking about people who have been extremely prolific at one level, and their critics were equally prolific, especially from the left. If you're looking at publications like Thackeray, which had a series of polemical arguments against. Therefore, your idea is, how are you going to filter this? What are the issues you're going to pick up? For instance, there is an extended debate about what should be the idea of a textile policy. There was a critique of the Congress's idea of Khadi, where they said that handloom is a far superior idea, because they said that in handloom, the fundamental unit is the society, and whereas in Khadi, the fundamental unit is an individual. And we need society as a fundamental unit, because society brings in an idea of an interlocking public. That was the argument which was put forth by the self-respect movement. And if you look at that entire debate, that alone runs for nearly 23,000 pages. Now, I am working on a biography for a mainstream publisher. And my mainstream publisher says very clearly that it cannot exceed 500 pages. Therefore, the first aspect is you start filtering. And you start filtering with 2 ideas. One, whether it can resonate with people who were part of this developments, as well as people who are looking at it after a passage of time. The way it has to reach both. It's not only trying to address people who were contemporaries of these leaders, but also to the next generation. Therefore, I can't talk about, say, anti-India agitation in an abstract sense. Are we able to relate the language struggle in a larger sense of the word? Therefore, once you have your filtering process, then you come into the idea of putting your text together. And there, what you do is you amplify certain things, and you do not amplify certain things primarily because of what are the things which quickly resonate is the one you take. For instance, of various films of Kalainar, I would have discussed a film called Parasakti slightly more. That is primarily because Parasakti resonated across the state in a much bigger way. It gave birth to one of the biggest stars called Shivaji Ganesh. So what you do is you also use this idea of complete balancing between what is in public interest and what public is interested in. Therefore, as a biographer, when you're trying to balance these 2 things, there is a filtering process, and the amount of inclusion is determined purely by this balance.
Can I ask the next question, Rohit? I just want to quickly also bring in Mr. Kannan, particularly on the point about how, you said you've written about Annadurai, Dr. MGR, such tall leaders, Mr. Kannan, in Tamil Nadu. And you've said about how there are so many, publications about their lives in Tamil. So when you write it in English, there's also a bigger audience perhaps that you're reaching countrywide. How do you ensure that a tall leader like Annadurai and his legacy is simplified for everyone to even understand across the country, people who may not be acquainted with politics in Tamil Nadu?
That's a very, very pertinent question. You should understand that most of us I have never seen Annadurai in my life. I've never even listened to him. So what appeals to me? I mean, he is as new to me as anyone else overseas,
Yeah.
or my children for that matter. So the things that appeal to me, things that catch my eye, catch my interest, are those that would also resonate with a larger audience. To simplify and to make them understand the background and the context, I would provide a bit of that. And some of it is also provided as footnotes and then endnotes. I wanted to, I don't know if I've answered your question to some extent, but most of these readers, fortunately or unfortunately, are limited to a Tamil speaking audience, as I said earlier, who would not be able to read this in Tamil. Overseas, even locally, and in the interest in some of this biography is because this hasn't happened in English so far. In fact, when Penguin approached us, we started off. I think we started off with Arna in 2010, and then already Chalapati was working on E.V. Ramasamy Periyar, and MGR was a proposition from them to me. To be honest, I wasn't very interested initially. I had, public perceptions of leaders are very different from what someone who works very closely with a particular leader or always had the benefit of being associated with that leader in one capacity or the other understands. Like, for instance, former Finance Secretary G. Ramachandran speaks of Charan Singh very highly, and that would surprise a number of us. So, it's a very complicated thing. And then on the other issue of prolific writing, I think it's a mixed blessing. Anna was a prolific writer. I had to sift through thousands of pages to find out, to narrow down which would interest, what would interest me, what would be important to highlight, what would not be important to highlight, etc. I have mostly delved and dependent on primary material and on people who have had the privilege of being associated with somebody like MGR or with Anna even. And I've always tried to juxtapose this with their critiques, as Panneer had also mentioned, and try to find a middle ground, because most of the vernacular biographies are all, I would say, hagiographies. There's nothing really objective in them. And that's where I think some of us who write in English have an advantage and have a duty, I would think, to project it objectively. I can tell you very frankly that my book on Anna was not liked by many of the DMK leaders. I know this for a fact. So I don't know if I'd answered your question, but
yes, absolutely. You can't please them all, can you?
No, I just wanted to tell you that I am a stranger myself. I have not interacted with MGR. I've seen him from a distance a couple of times.
But how do you connect with them, Mr. Kannan? You haven't met Mr. Annadurai, you haven't met Dr. MGR. How do you then decide that, because you did agree with Mr. Jairam Ramesh that you have to have a certain connect to be able to write a biography on them? And when you haven't met someone, how do you still know that you have the certain connect with them and have decided to write about them?
Some of it is also because from where my upbringing, where I grew up in the north of Madras. This is the bastion of the DMK. This is where the DMK was founded. I just grew, my household was about a stone's throw away from where the DMK was founded. And when Annadurai died, I was a little child, and then my father told me what had happened that day. I still remember I was a 7-year-old child, and the whole city had come to a standstill. I was, I wanted to just go out and play, and then everything was shut. And then my father explained what it was. And as I grew up, I understood what a tall leader this man was, who was actually only 5.3. And then it was Hindu's Ram who actually gave me an opening when I did an op-ed on him for one of his birthdays. And then that gave me the idea of writing about him because I felt that there was a huge lacuna in biographies. And then, and then Penguin came along and then they wanted to fill this void. And then people like I stepped in. That was it.
Rohit, you'd like to come in?
Because following the order of things, because Mr. Kannan is answering, I'll have Kannan and one from Mr. Panneerselvan. But I'll begin with Mr. Kannan. So, Mr. Kannan, I was revisiting the chapter on the strains of discord, right, in the book on Anna. And what is interesting is I find your handling of the Maniammai and Periyar and Anna controversy very delicate, very nuanced. I think very close to what academic historians would be doing. But I also find that perhaps for reasons of not getting into the journalistic, tendencies of finding things which would be palatable to the larger public or the TRPs or juicy tidbits, so to speak, you do skirt around some issues. And that, what I'm trying to get at it, this reminds me of Keshav Chandra Sen, the founder of the Brahmo Samaj, and his marriage to somebody, his marrying his daughter off at what was the Brahmo Samaj's then argument, way below what should be the right age for consent to marriage for women. And he married his daughter off, and that led to a split in the organization of the Brahmo Samaj back in the day, and the new Brahmo Samaj was formed. This was huge in colonial India. So in this controversy, the Maniammai, Periyar and Anna discord, do you think you could have delved a bit more, but there were those constraints that this then becomes sort of a gossip column or something of the sort, which prevented you from getting as much into this?
I didn't quite follow you, Rohit.
So my question is, so a lot has been written about the discord between Anna and Periyar, and how the details and how the association with Maniammai might have led to that. Of course, you deal with that in your chapter on strains of discord. But do you think that you were being economical there? I'm being direct here. Do you think you were being economical there instead of delving more into what led to the discord?
No, not at all. I think I've spelt it out very, very clearly. And we all have these page constraints and so on. It wasn't an issue at all. I think it was made an issue, as I very clearly spell it out in my book. It was the easiest charge that would fly, against Periyar. It was in 1949. This was a 72-year-old man trying to marry a 29-year-old woman. It was no marriage of the marriages that you and I are familiar with. This was a woman who had dedicated her life for this man. Her father had sent her away from Vello, Kadagasabay Mubaliyar, and she was ministering for him. And everybody knew this. And this was an arrangement, this was a legal arrangement. And Periyar had explained all this, that this is not a regular marriage in the traditional sense. Okay, this is the only way we could go about it. So I think I've said it all, and then there's a lot of I would say not very kosher material out there in Tamil, right? And people like us will have to really sanitize some of this material, especially when it comes to even Annadurai. I would say, like, if I were to spell out everything, in 1958, poet Bharatidasan wrote caustically about, nastily about Annadurai, talking about his household as a brothel. How could a biographer put it in writing, in such graphic detail? It would be. I wouldn't be able to do it because I can understand. I mean, I will never be able to understand why poet Bharatidasan did that. Okay, it's actually under the table, except for those who would go and look for it. Most of the Dravidian authors and others would try to actually hide it because it's very inconvenient, the discord between Bharatidasan and so on. And Periyar himself has said some terrible things about Annadurai. But a biographer will have to be, will have to do a little bit of sanitizing, I think, because I think we are duty bound to do that, because some of this is very, very unpalatable to read, and it will completely digress from the book. As far as EVR and Maniammai and Anna go, I think everything had been said. And the truth of the matter is that was not the issue at all. It was a peg to hang and then to come out of Periyar. They wanted to bolt a long time ago. And Periyar, so this was, Periyar was checkmating them and then they were checkmating the other and so on. And that was it. So the marriage is not an issue, and they've admitted this. Professor Anbarahan himself had said this in the latter years, and this was no issue.
A question to Mr. Panneerselvan, I think also relates to what Akshita was asking. In your book, you actually trace this longer intellectual history, so to speak, right, from Periyar. There's that idea of the legacy, the intellectual legacy of the Dravidian. I would like to sort of draw you out and comment on something which you perhaps did not elaborate as much, because also what Mr. Kannan was talking about, editorial decisions. So we are aware that Periyar, post his return from Soviet Russia, was completely smitten by what he saw. And initially, before the British repression, he was taking his party towards a more socialistic direction and so on. Post 1935, he of course went back to the self-respecting because there was British repression. In light of that, let's say under that overarching ideological legacy, how would you look at the debate, when you see the fallout between the RSU cable and the, Sumangali cable vision controversy? Do you think that the Dravidian parties later, who still sort of think of themselves as Periyar's carrier of Periyar's tradition, have flirted with big capital in a way that Periyar may not have really envisioned, their flirtations with big capital?
I think it is grossly unfair to compare the situation of 1920s with 2010. 100 years of the progress and 100 years of ground reality which has been changed is so significant. See, for Periyar, he has to work on one fundamental defining issue. He felt that the idea of class through which the Indian left was working was inadequate to understand the idea of humiliation. He felt that the idea of humiliation has been embedded more in the caste. And that was a departure for Periyar. See, we have to also remember that Periyar's publication house was the one which brought out Communist Manifesto in Tamil. It was one of the earliest translations of the manifesto in any of the Indian languages. For him to move away from that was what is going to be the defining identity which we are going to use to fight humiliation. This cannot be conflated with corporate interest or the people who have business interest in politics. When you are talking about Sumangali cables, Sumangali cable is not coming up with a ideological vision for Tamil Nadu or for India. Therefore, I think we can't conflate these two things. We can't conflate people who have an ideological vision with people who are running a successful business enterprises. Successful business enterprises and its logics are completely different from people who are having a vision for governance. This will actually deflect our attention from the key questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just bring in Vaibhav. He's been waiting for quite a bit. Thanks for your patience, Vaibhav. You've written that book on Veer Savarkar. I've been speaking to Mr. Jairam, Ramesh, to Mr. Kannan, Mr. Panneerselvan. The sense I get is when you write a biography, especially one on someone like Savarkar, it also invites a lot of opinion, perhaps very often a lot of very, very harsh criticism. So how do you deal with that? When, for example, someone comes out to maybe say that, you've colored Savarkar a certain way, or that you're an apologist?
Well, that just makes me feel all the more better that I wrote the biography, because it just shows how people have a very extreme reactions to a personality. Either they worship him, they follow his ideology, they think that his ideas ought to be taken up for the rise of India as a superpower, or whatever we may call it. And there are others who call him an apologist for the British Empire. a person who betrayed the national freedom struggle. It just makes one feel good that yeah, exactly. He's a person who draws extreme reactions, and there's no getting away from it. But that is the truth about Savarkar, that he is indeed a controversial personality. And like the other subject of my biography, Bal Thackeray, he actually liked being controversial. He did not see it as a negative thing at all. So when he wrote the fact, in a Marathi publication, that he had no problem if Hindus ate beef, he was being deliberately. He knew it would create a lot of controversy, and that the Hindus were wrong in cramming 33 crore deities in a cow's belly. He knew he was being extremely controversial. Or when he said during an annual Marathi literary conference that writers ought to now keep their pens down and take up guns, for the cause of liberation. He knew he would attract very extreme reactions, and these personalities actually reveled in all of that. And so did Bal Thackeray. As we know, Mr. Kannan was talking about stuff that was completely unprintable and unpublishable about his subject. Now, if one looks at Bal Thackeray's writings and speeches from the 1960s onwards, whether he's writing in his weekly magazine Marmik or speaking at a public rally at Shivaji Park, about 50% of the stuff is untranslatable, and the other 20 and some 25% is unprintable. So you're left with 25%. But that's the nature of these people, and I think it makes them all the more fascinating for a biographer like me. And it is important, and I think what Mr. Jairam Ramesh said is extremely important here, that a biographer looks at narrative. I think a narrative is very important. I would say it's the most important thing, because you want to ultimately draw in the reader, and you do not want to alienate a reader. You know, so it is
But
important
is
that
the ultimate goal of a biographer then, Vaibhav, is the ultimate
yeah.
goal of a biographer to help the reader form an opinion about the person and then take a side? Is that the ultimate goal?
No, taking sides is not the ultimate goal of a biographer at all. But I completely agree with what Jairam Ramesh said, that the idea of a biographer is firstly to be dispassionate. That does not mean you are neutral. You take a position, but you are dispassionate. You present all the facts as you have discovered those facts. You present all the archival records, stuff written or spoken by their followers, by their stern opponents. In the case of Savarkar, I have quoted his opponents extensively, including top leaders of the British Empire, of the British government at that time. There are British government records from Scotland Yard and other places. There is Ambedkar's very strong and stringent criticism of Savarkar in his book Partition, or Pakistan, or the Partition of India. There are complementary references to Savarkar made by Mahatma Gandhi. Surprisingly for many perhaps surprisingly for many Congress people, even by Jawaharlal Nehru in a letter to his father Motilal Nehru, which he writes when he's studying in England. He writes to Motilal Nehru that he finds Savarkar's book on 1857 fascinating, and it's a brilliant study of the 1857 mutiny from an Indian point of view, which destroys the myths that are being perpetuated by the British Empire. And even late in his later years, Jawaharlal Nehru, while being sternly opposed to Savarkar as a political opponent of his, as a political adversary, uh, speaks of the need to have a fresh edition out of Savarkar's 1857 book. This is after Savarkar has already turned into a Hindutvawadi. At the same time, in 1941, there is Savarkar issuing a statement to the press, and a public statement, when Jawaharlal Nehru is arrested in the year 1941, just ahead of the 1942 Quit India movement, that Jawaharlal Nehru, was born with a silver spoon, and he has sacrificed everything for this country, and he has given everything. He hasn't lived a life of privilege, and he must be released immediately because he is a true patriot. Now, these are things that are absolutely fascinating for me as a 21st century Indian, because the narratives I hear are, Savarkar was writing mercy petitions when Nehru was sleeping on the dirt floor of a jail. or that Nehru was enjoying his life when Patel was suffering in jail. So these are these are the kind of narratives that one sees, and one when looks closely at the material available, things turn out to be far more complex. Yes, there is considerable uh, political a fight happening. There is a political struggle, ideological opposition happening. But there are these nuggets too. There is at the heart of it all an essential respect for each other that I see in the writings of Savarkar, that I see in the writings of Jawaharlal Nehru, that I see in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, even Bose, Subhash Bose. Bose, when Savarkar is released from his internment of 14 years in Ratnagiri in 1937, Subhash Bose says that there is not a single Indian who will not be delighted at the release of this man who has suffered so much for this country. And later on, the same Bose criticizes Savarkar, when he talks about Hindu-Muslim relations, saying that Savarkar is unable to see things from a global point of view. He's just too caught up with the Hindu-Muslim equation. The same Netaji goes to meet Savarkar when the whole Hindu-Muslim question is being discussed, and has a detailed interaction, an in-depth kind of interaction with Savarkar out of sheer respect for him. So things are a lot more complex than we think they are, or we are made to believe they are. And I myself am a journalist, and I'm aware that as journalists we write the first draft of history, and when we write the first draft of history, we are somewhere intrinsically aware that this is not the complete draft. So one of my decisions has been to stand back and look at doing a fresh draft, which is more detailed, more in depth, a little more nuanced, and I think that has been my effort all along.
Rohit, do you want to come in?
Vaibhav,
Rohit, you're on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Vaibhav, you spoke about you drawing in the readers. I think how you begin your biography on Bal Thackeray is absolutely fascinating. You make the reader a part of the funeral procession, of the ceremony, and the reader has to follow him through that. So whether somebody likes Bal Thackeray or hates him, to get to the latter half of your book, the person has to first understand this dynamism of the person and the popularity he enjoyed, because he has to follow you through that procession, right? So that from Matoshri, so that was brilliant. But my question actually goes back to the Savarkar book. Historians who have been critical of Savarkar have tried to actually plot the divide between Savarkar and Gandhi right from the 1906, October 1906 meet at Shyamji Krishna Verma's house in Highgate. Do you think at some place, because he wanted to continue with a narrative of a conversational, a discourse between Savarkar and Gandhi till a later date, do you think you did not choose that strategy? That there was a split right there at Shyamji Krishna Verma's house at 1906, which is what traditional historians have done. They said that there was an ideological split there, and Gandhi saw a militant Savarkar and washed his hands off and said that I don't want to engage with this person. Do you think that was a conscious decision, not to highlight the split there?
No, absolutely not. See, there is no question about the fact that Gandhi and Savarkar were ideologically opposed to each other, and neither made any attempt to hide their opposition in ideological terms to each other. But that did not mean that there was no conversation happening, or there was no mutual respect, an essential respect, I'm saying, as a human being, or as contemporaries in the freedom struggle of this country. So when Gandhi leaves England in 1909 after visiting it and is on his way to South Africa, he writes Hind Swaraj, in which he very strongly criticizes the Indian revolutionaries for the violent methods that they have adopted. And I have written in detail about Gandhi's critique of Savarkar there and the other Indian revolutionaries there, as well as Savarkar's response to Gandhi's arguments, where Savarkar says that we don't love really being violent. We are violent because we have no constitutional methods open to us, available to us. So there was absolutely no question of hiding anything. The idea was to present a complete and well-rounded picture, a picture that is not selective. In fact, the idea was the exact opposite, to present a comprehensive picture that presents all sides of the equation. And I think that is essential to understand historical personalities at a in the first place, because if we say, for instance, do not look at the personal and political transformation that Savarkar went through uh, in Port Blair, and after he emerged from the Port Blair prison, we are unable to understand Savarkar's personality as a whole. There are those who will look only at Savarkar as a political revolutionary, and there are those who will look at him only as a champion of Hindutva. But we have to look at the transformation that he underwent, and that is when we see Savarkar as a whole. Otherwise, we are just seeing parts of the puzzle. We'll need to put those parts together, and my attempt was to put those parts together.
Uh, Let me bring up Mr. Jairam Ramesh to this conversation. Mr. Ramesh, why did you choose to go ahead and write a biography on Indira Gandhi? Her life has been chronicled so many times, and this is something that someone else also had agreed with, saying that they wouldn't have chosen to go ahead and write about someone like Indira Gandhi simply because she's been written about so much. There are so many books out there about the life and times of Indira Gandhi. Why did you decide to write about her, and why particularly about her as an environmentalist?
Well, the biography is a very limited biography. It's an
Yeah.
environmental biography of Indira Gandhi, because she was India's first and last prime minister to take the cause of the environment seriously. She walked the talk, and there's a look at all the laws that were passed, the institutions that were created, the regulations that were promulgated were all done during her time. She was really a visionary when it came to that. Our image of Indira Gandhi, one image is the Durga image, and the other image is the architect of the emergency image. But there's a third Indira Gandhi who saw herself as a child of nature, who saw herself, as some because of her education in Shantiniketan and in Switzerland, and because of her constant exposure to hill stations on account of the illness of her mother, and also in large part because of Nehru's reading list, which he thrust down his daughter, including Salim Ali's Book of Indian Birds, way back in 1941 when both of them were in jail. So it's a limited biography. It's not a political biography. It's not a biography of her economic policy. It's not a biography of her foreign policy. It's not like Catherine Frank, which is a life story of Indira Gandhi. It's a limited perspective of her environmental record, of her as an environmentalist and as a naturalist. But I just want to go back to a point that Vaibhav made in the course of his explanation on Savarkar. Unfortunately, what happens when journalists or historians write these biographies, they have some hidden agenda. They have some agenda is overt and some agenda is covert. And unfortunately, these agendas are becoming far more evident in the last couple of years. Gone are the days of genuine scholarship when it comes to writing of biographies. And I think what we really are missing in the Indian context, barring, of course, the books that Mr. Kannan and Panneerselvan have produced, and earlier generation of biographers like Rajmohan Gandhi and S. Gopal, we are missing the tradition of scholarship. We have the tradition of agendas now. So you'll have liberals writing about Savarkar the bigot, and you have the Hindutva guys talking about Savarkar the hero. So the scholarship, genuine scholarship, is conspicuous by its absence in biography writing. There have been a lot of biographies on Patel, for example, in the last couple of years, and they all have been actuated by an agenda. But the best biography of Patel remains Rajmohan Gandhi's biography, which is meticulous and based entirely on the archives of Patel, of Gandhi, of Nehru, and the freedom movement. So I would stress that the first and most important requirement of a biographer is to have a commitment to scholarship. and not to have an overt or a covert political agenda.
Mr. Ramesh, I'm glad you touched upon this because I think it'd be fair to refer to you as a veteran author of sorts, having written so many books. You've written biographies, you've written other books as well. So what's the difference between, writing a biography and all the other books you've written? What do you feel is really the difference in the entire process?
Well, biography is ultimately about a person, but what you do is use the person as a symbol of the times. In the case of Krishna Menon, for example, it was a discussion of India of the 40s and 50s and early 60s in which Krishna Menon played a pivotal role. In biographies, you have to be more careful, as I said. You have to keep your biases out. You have to keep your prejudices out, and you have to be cold-blooded and dispassionate when it comes to writing biographies. And you really, you have to be a forensic scientist to write a good biography. Really get into the level of detail, and I think that's. I miss good biographies. I mean, the great biographies in England.
Which was the last one, last good one that you read, Mr. Ramesh?
But the three biographies that Rajmohan has written, for example, he wrote a biography of Gandhi, he wrote a biography of Patel, and he wrote a biography of Nehru. Of Rajaji. And you look at the 3 volumes that Gopal has produced. And of course, as far as the masterpiece political biography in India is Gopal's biography of his father, Radhakrishnan. And just imagine the son writing about the father, saying that the father was in his element giving a speech, and in the front row sat his wife and his mistress. I mean, that is the height of objectivity. The Sarve Kapali Gopal. And he starts his biography of his father by saying that Radhakrishnan was the son of his mother and an itinerant Vaishnavite official, something that will amuse Panneerselvan and Mr. Kannan. And this really created a huge furore in Gopal's family, in his immediate family circles.
I can imagine.
These are the great biographers that we have produced.
Mr. Kannan, would you agree that, right now biographies are more agenda-driven?
I would say that I would agree with Mr. Ramesh to a large extent. I would say that scholarship is something that we definitely require. And the difference between Gopal and us is that these are historians by training. These are scholars. These are people who are attached to universities. Look at us. Mr. Ramesh is a parliamentarian, is a politician, firstly, and maybe he, would give guest lectures at universities, etc. I mean, nobody doubts his scholarship, but their vocation, their avocation, their profession, their commitment, their livelihood, their life, everything was scholarship. So what else would you expect? And going back to Mr. Ramesh and Gopal's objectivity about his father, is that really objective? Maybe he had a grouse against the mistress. He was his mother's son, after all. No. So I completely agree. Scholarship is the most important, and in scholarship is essentially speaking the truth. And the writer should not have an agenda. I must confess that I have sought a DMK ticket for the last 30 years, either to run as a legislator or to run for parliament. Okay, fortunately, I would think, because my wife is a much more serious a believer than I. She, must have prayed to all the 330 million Hindu deities. So I've never been given a ticket, as you know. I came very close to landing a ticket in '96 for Parliament, but didn't make it. So, there were moments when I was tempted to compromise while writing MGR. And I must say, in all honesty, I didn't. And then with the present chief minister, in fact, I had invited him to launch the book. And then I told him, listen, this has very difficult portions on Talaivar, on Dad. And he said to me, how can I launch this book? So I said, well, I gave him a 4-page a memo in which I said, listen, you come and launch this book, and then you say, I praise his objectivity, but I don't agree to anything that he has said about dad. He doesn't know anything. Why don't you come and do this? And then you're a great MGR fan. MGR insisted that you call him Periyappa, uh, elder father, etc. So
You
why don't you
mentioned
do
this
this?
over again in the election also.
And he was, I must say, he was tempted. And I know who stopped him from coming. So, the writer shouldn't have an agenda. Panneerselvan doesn't have an agenda, but someone like me, I must confess that that agenda is still very much there, and then so I'll have to be very very careful when I write these things, because I shouldn't let my personal interests come in the way. And Mr. Stalin himself told me that he has no problem in me writing what I write, but not as a DMK man. And if I was a DMK man, then I would be a dyed-in-the-wool DMK man. Then I wouldn't be writing. If I were representing the DMK, I would not be able to write any of these books, because then I will have to be committed to the party. So it'll be very difficult. Few might have the room that Mr. Ramesh, my good friend and the man who brought me into the UN, Sashi Tharoor, have. And then some of this writing will sometimes come back to haunt you, like in the case of when Gujral appointed Sengupta, I think, as his advice. Yeah, Mr. Ramesh would remember that. And then he had written something in the past, and then people who didn't like him and then who didn't like Gujral very much embarrassed Gujral. This was the first man who was, I think, that the Prime Minister had appointed ever as advisors, political advisor or diplomatic advisor, or as though there's a dearth of diplomatic advisors. I think that's the ilk that has grown, that has to be actually really culled.
Rohit, you want to comment? We've lost you briefly there.
Yeah, sorry, I lost my internet briefly. Before I come in, I could see that there was a question from Srinonti. Has she asked a question? She had posed a question to.
No, she didn't.
Srinonti, if you can hear us, would you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? Would you want to turn on your camera and ask the question? Srinonti, if you can hear us. Mr. Ramesh, you might not be able to spot the question, so I'll just read it out for you. It's there on the chat section. I don't think Srimonti can hear us. Climate change scientists and then climate historians, at least since the early 2000s, have been drawing our attention to how the global footprint of human population was already well on its way to pass the 9 billion mark by 2050. It's only now that nation states have the significance of thinking seriously about addressing the world population question. Do you see, and if so, in what ways, a connection between Indira Gandhi's significant engagements with environmental degradation, naturism, and her efforts at reducing human numbers in India? Do you find her articulating this connected concern in the primary materials that you have engaged in?
Well, if the question deals with the interrelationship between population and the environment, let me say that between 1992 and the year 2010, the population of China was almost stable and declined somewhat marginally. However, the Chinese contribution to global emissions went up from something like 10% to over 25%. The point is that it's not population per se that imposes the load on the environment, it's the pattern of consumption. It's the consumption pattern that is very, very important. It's what you consume, how much you consume, how much energy you consume, how much electricity you consume, how much of natural resources you consume. So that's really, the crucial issue. In the West, there has been this great bogey of the population explosion being the primary cause of environmental degradation and destruction. It goes back to the 1960s. But I think that's been conclusively demonstrated that it's not population primarily, but it's the pattern of consumption. I mean, look at the United States. 5% of the world's population, accounts for something like 20%, between 15 to 20% of greenhouse gas emission. So focus on consumption. Population will take care of itself. Already, most states of India, starting with Kerala in 1988 and Tamil Nadu in 1993, almost most of the states of India, barring 6 states, have crossed the replacement levels of fertility. They're below 2.1. And in another 3-4 years' time, almost all states, barring UP and Bihar, will have crossed this level, and UP and Bihar will also cross this level by the end of the decade. So India is actually at below replacement levels of fertility.
Right, right. Akshita, I'll just ask one more question and then pass it on to you.
Sure.
I think I touched upon this and Mr. Ramesh, and I could, before I lost my internet, I could see that Mr. Kannan had also touched upon this, which is how professional historian biographers differ from, those writing for the public and for more of a general audience. And the question of Sarvapalli Gopal actually comes in, which is very interesting because Gopal, when writing the biography of his father, most of his sources came from archives which were still within the Radhakrishnan family. And I think, Mr. Ramesh, and this is very intriguing, when I was reading your book on Krishna Menon, you actually nuanced this very carefully on how R.P. Dutt meets Nehru, finally, at the sanatorium. You carefully point out that Gopal argues that this was a chance meeting, but then Callaghan actually says that it was planned all along to get a reading of the Indian situation. This is where maybe anybody can come in, Mr. Panneerselvan, Kannan, Vaibhav, and Mr. Ramesh as well. So the thing is, when you are interpreting source materials, and we do that as historians as well, there is a proclivity to sometimes, perhaps be guided by your own authorial positioning. This does not necessarily tend to be a bias of sorts, but to be guided by authorial positioning. And I'll briefly begin with the example of Mr. Ramesh's book on Haksar and Mrs. Gandhi. So in the interpretation of how Haksar becomes Mrs. Gandhi's advisor and then brings with him this entire entourage from the CPI, from the former CPI, I think, Mr. Ramesh, if I'm not wrong, your interpretation is that they felt that there was something really happening, moving, as part of Mrs. Gandhi's advisory group and Haksar. So, which was also why many of these people, many of the former comrades of Haksar would come and join them, leaving the rank and file of the CPI. Now the CPI, or somebody aligned to the CPI, their interpretation would be that, well, there was the lure of power, right? The proximity to power. Now, you have of course chosen to side that there were these things happening. Haksar was a man of action. He was really accommodative, and Mrs. Gandhi listened to him. So where does authorial positioning play a role when it comes to writing biographies? And authorial positioning, I'm being very nuanced here. I'm putting in the caveat. This does not mean bias. I'm talking about where you position yourself with the larger trajectory that you're drawing out.
Well, I'll let the others answer this question, but as far as the specific instance that you have raised, yes, there are multiple interpretations that are possible, no doubt, based on the same archival evidence. So you go with your judgment. Biographer also requires judgment. Biographer is not a clean slate. You don't go into an archive with a clean mind. You roughly have an idea of what you're looking for and what you want to say, and you're looking for affirmation from the archival sources. But this is where I think judgment is very important. And I've been lucky that I've been in public life, so therefore I've been exposed to different types of people, different situations. There is a certain judgment. Judgment also comes from a reading of political history. It comes from, I think you need to read different views of political history. People who read only one view of Savarkar will obviously pontificate only on that point of view. So very few people, and Vaibhav is one of perhaps the only exception, who is able to bring out Savarkar in all his multiple roles and multiple avatars and all his contradictions. But I think interpretations are different. It's what interpretation that you give to the best of your ability and based on the sources that are available to you. You have to be honest with your source, Rohit. You can't take liberty with your archival sources.
Vaibhav would like to take that. Another contemporary who has analyzed the mercy petitions of Savarkar, has interpreted it in a way that the conditions in Andaman were terrible, and that could have been one of the reasons why Savarkar sort of caved in. One interpretation. There are multiple other interpretations out there that Savarkar had a changed trajectory after he came out. So where does authorial positioning play a role when you're sort of interpreting your sources as a biographer? And authorial positioning is, completely different from a bias. There's a positioning, a place where you position yourself on the wider political spectrum.
I think, Rohit, authorial positioning has to be there and is present all through. It's never not present. It's always going to be there, and I would say that it's necessary because a biographer has to be selective about the facts that he brings out. Any biographer who says that I did not select the facts is perhaps being a little dishonest. Because, for instance, we have already seen Mr. Panneerselvan said that if Karunanidhi has written and others have say someone has written 3 lakh pages, you have to select as a biographer. You cannot possibly take everything and print it. You have, and like the great historian E.H. Carr said, all fact is interpretation. So the fact that a biographer picks out from the archives is his selection and his interpretation, and that then becomes the historical facts. There are all kinds of facts lying in the records, but when you pick it out and put it in your book, in your biography, it becomes a historical fact. So it is absolutely necessary for a biographer, even when the biographer is trying to be as dispassionate as possible, to be selective about what he or she is picking, and that will always be there. Yes, there is a caveat here. One has to certainly check a number of things. I will give you an example. So Savarkar writes about his experiences in Port Blair in the Kalapani prison, and there he talks about the Islamic fanaticism of most of the jailers there, and how they were trying to convert Hindus and allowed the Muslim prisoners to perform namaz and would not allow Hindu prisoners to do certain things, etc., etc. Now, this is Savarkar's claim in his book. Now, I need to check it because one has to corroborate it. So, one has to look at British records in the first place, a review report on the Andaman prison done by a neutral authority that was sent there after a lot of uproar took place in the British Parliament. I had to look up the accounts of Barindra Kumar Ghosh, Aurobindo Ghosh's brother, about his years in the Andamans, because he was in the Port Blair prison at the same time that Savarkar was there. And he has written about the same jailers in his book. I had to look up the account of Ullaskar Datta, another Bengali revolutionary of the period. The interesting bit was both Barindra Kumar Ghosh and Ullaskar Datta actually corroborate what Savarkar is saying. And the even more interesting bit is that these people had similar experiences. But Savarkar became a champion of Hindutva, and some other people who underwent the same experiences never took up Hindutva as an ideological position. These are interesting revelations, but one has to carry out some checks from contemporary sources to corroborate what the subject of one's biography is sometimes saying. But yes, selection is necessary. There's no option available to a historian or to a biography than be selective about.
But then I come back to the question that I asked earlier about objectivity, Vaibhav. When the author has the option of filtering, of selecting, deselecting,
Right.
then comes the question of whether you can be neutral in that. If you, for example, leave a chapter that was critical of Savarkar, then that's bound to also bring in a lot of questions about why that point was left out.
Yeah, that would happen if a chapter that is critical of Savarkar were truly left out. Okay, at least in my case, I can honestly say I haven't left out any uncomfortable points there. But an attempt to be objective would have to be made by a biographer, definitely. But 100% objectivity is certainly not possible. Is what I'm trying to say. Interpretation will always come into the picture. Your selection as a biographer will always come into the picture. I think what you can try and do as a biographer is to be as fair to the subject and as fair to the subject's sternest critics as possible. And I think that is where the integrity of the writer of a biographer comes in, and that depends on the individual. So whether I have it or not, I cannot say for myself. The reader of my book can tell whether I have been truly objective and fair in my interpretation of facts or not.
Yeah, and this is something that Mr. Kannan also had touched upon. Mr. Panneerselvan, you wanted to make a point.
I have a problem with this idea called neutral. Neutral and empathy don't go hand in hand. I came into journalism because I wanted India to be a better place. I did not come into journalism to be a neutral observer. I'm not an dispassionate observer. I'm a passionate citizen who want to see certain amount of transformation to happen. Therefore, there is too much of problem if we try to valorize that word neutral. What we have to keep in mind is it fair? Does it maintain a critical distance between the subject and the person who's writing about the subject? Is there an act of verification? And does it refrain from myth making? If it refrains from myth making and if there is an act of verification, then it's a completely different issue. The thing is, with this neutrality business, there is no space for empathy. Without empathy, I don't think you can take up such a work. There is sympathy for the nation builders. That's the reason people try to write about them. And if the moment that the empathy gets disembedded from your work, you're not going to get in. What is such why should somebody invest so much of time in going through all these materials? There is an amount of empathy. Therefore, yes.
Panneerselvan, sorry, sorry to interrupt you, but as I said right at the beginning, you can be objective, but you can never be neutral.
Yes.
So, I agree with you. You're not neutral. I am not neutral. Mr. Kannan is not neutral. But we can be objective while not being neutral. That's the point. There is a fine distinction between being objective and being neutral. And I am not advocating neutrality. I am advocating objectivity.
The thing is, if we are providing some material which becomes an insight to understand a political party or a political leadership, then we have delivered.
Yes, I agree.
If we are going to add one element of new understanding, I think that my book helps to understand that of the two strands of modern India making, one is coming together, another one is holding together. I think that Dravidian movement represents coming together stream, which is a voluntary participation, which is as opposed to holding together. And if my book helps you to understand how these leaders contributed towards coming together stream, I have delivered. Therefore, it's not about neutrality. I can't put same emphasis on holding together idea of India. Holding together idea of India is different. And coming together idea of India is different. Therefore, for me, this idea of coming together India and how does various parties and ideologies contributed. I was really impressed by the from Pune to Ambedkar, the type of movements which happen in the West. I was impressed by social movements elsewhere in this country. Therefore, it's all these things have a symbiotic relationship. Therefore, on the symbiotic relationship, we actually pick up one theme to write. And that theme is not a neutral theme. That theme is the one which actually animates me. For me, the idea of coming together animates me, and the idea of holding together disturbs me. That is a central theme through which this entire book has been written.
Mr.
No,
Panneerselvan, I had asked this question to Mr. Kannan also about how you ensure that your audience, considering you're writing an English book, when I asked Mr. Kannan about, how you ensure people connect with an Annadurai or an MGR, how do you make people connect with the idea of Dravidianism, which in other places in India would just, people would just not be able to connect to it the way people in Tamil Nadu do?
I don't think so. Actually, after two major developments, one was a Mandal Commission implementation, which led to some sort of a major transformation within the northern politics, especially when we see people like Lalu Prasad Yadav and others coming in. We think that the idea of affirmative action, where the state can actually generate space to accommodate multiple aspirations of the people, as understood. Therefore, what we mean by Dravidian movement is the fundamental question. For me, the Dravidian movement is the one which comes up with schemes of affirmative actions, and these affirmative actions are slightly different from an econometrist viewpoint. For instance, econometrists always talk about targeted beneficiary, and Tamil Nadu always believed in universal beneficiary. They say that the moment people are given universal coverage, they will not come and take up certain things if they don't need. For instance, the PDS in Tamil Nadu is a universal PDS. It is not a targeted PDS. And the affordable middle class is not taking into that PDS at all. Another thing is, Dravidian movement says that this idea of targeted one actually creates too many filters and bring in power. But the moment you make your affirmative action universal, you are not creating power filters. Therefore, that is the next understanding of the Dravidian movement. As I said, I try to look at it from these two trajectories, coming together and holding together. And for within the coming together, I can look at series of events. One is affirmative action. Second is inclusive social growth. Third is gender justice. Remember, it was Justice Party which gave women's voting rights first. Only in 1952, India and women were given voting rights. But in Tamil Nadu or that the Madras province, in the Justice Party government, it gave voting rights to women. The way to gender justice, all these things have been coming together in your biography.
So, Mr. Kannan, if you could come in on that also. The reason I asked this question is things like, a much debated issue like a language fight that happens in Tamil Nadu. Is that something that people can connect with? The DMK, using terms like Ondri Arasu instead of Mati Arasu right now. Are those things that people can really connect with nationwide?
I'm not so sure, and I understand what our colleague Panneerselvan is putting forward, but I think what is at stake is the competing visions of India. The Dravidian movement has a particular vision of India, a plural India, which will be truly federal. Now, nobody had bought into this idea. I'd gone into the National Development Council debates. I've seen all the chief ministers' presentations over the years. The only man who had ever spoken about federalism and in that depth and in that width is Mr. Karunanidhi. And prior to him, his mentor, the founder of the DMK. Now, his federalism should be, picked up by the leftists, should be picked up by the number of regional parties that have sprung up, right? Nobody speaks about this. Nobody had. So, to me, the Dravidian movement represents a cultural nationalism. That's where the question of language comes in. We're the only ones, the Tamils, the DMK in particular, are the only ones who are putting forward this idea that all these Schedule 8 languages should become national languages. Are the Assamese saying this? Are the Kannadigas saying this? Are the others saying this? So I'm not so sure that there is buy-in for this, idea that the Dravidian movement is espoused. And I'm not also sure that the Dravidian movement or the Justice Party is all kosher. Remember, this was the party, the Justice Party was the first party, which was asking for affirmative action for a majority, non-Brahmins. So, against a 3% minority. So, it's very complex. I would say, my understanding of the Dravidian movement is that we are talking about an India where we will not turn Indians into Hindians, but where I could be a Tamil speaking Indian and with the same rights as somebody from the UP heartland or Vaibhav from Maharashtra or elsewhere. That is principally because I poured into all the writings of Mr. Karunanidhi, Annadurai. I would say 8 out of 10 pages are on language or
They
on
were very
caste.
passionate about it.
Yes, but they were the only ones who were passionate about it. It was not the entire South. That's what I'm saying. Even Mr. Bhaktavachalam was not passionate about it. Mr. Kamaraj wasn't passionate about it. He was blindsided by this movement. He was a great man. This was the only man who had traveled to all the 12,000 major villages in Tamil Nadu twice. Can anybody claim that feat? No. But this party, which had come from behind, had completely dethroned him. He was blindsided by it. And it was simply the question of language. It was not even caste. Affirmative action, unfortunately, has completely entrenched caste in Tamil Nadu. So the movement is actually a failure when it comes to eradicating caste. Mr. Annadurai puts forward 5 major principles in 1965 in an interview to the Illustrated Weekly. And one of them is caste eradication, an egalitarian society, federalism, state autonomy, and things like that. So these are general egalitarian principles. I wouldn't say that the Dravidian movement has gotten buy-in outside Tamil Nadu, and even within Tamil Nadu, I'm not so sure that it resonates outside, the core Tamils and so on and so forth.
Just a follow-up question quickly, Mr. Kannan, which is that, even when I spoke to so many people, very often the question when it comes to Tamil Nadu is people are so religious, they're so devout, and yet you've got Dravidianism that survives in a state like that. And many have tried to understand what really it is about the people of Tamil Nadu. How are they so religious, perhaps the most religious of the country as a community, but at the same time when they vote, they keep their religion out?
I think the Tamils are quite practical. They've kept the two spheres separate. E.V. Ramasamy Periyar is very, very, open about it. He says, I would never run for elections because nobody will vote for me. So, and I personally think that most Tamils don't take two things seriously. I don't think, except in 1983, they took the Sri Lankan issue seriously. Except in 2009, they did not take the Sri Lankan issue seriously. It was never an election issue, except in 2009 to some extent, perhaps. Similarly, the question of faith. I don't think it is serious. People keep these two spheres separately, and they're very happy about it. And therefore, we can say anything about anybody, including Ram, and then we could, whatever, and then get away with it. It's something that that's all I can tell you about because it's unique.
Yeah, it most definitely is. You won't see this in any other state. Mr. Jairam Ramesh, before we started this conversation, you were saying about how you would have liked to write a book on Mr. Kamaraj. If you were to write a biography on a current political leader, who would you choose?
Well, I would never write a biography of a current political leader.
Too controversial?
It's impossible. I mean, it's impossible to be objective about current political leaders, and it's only, about leaders who have gone by, who leave behind records that you can actually write about. I can't write about somebody who's living, And I think you need a little bit of time. You need some gap between when a person is working and living, and a time to reassess, a time to evaluate, time to make up your own mind and make up your own judgment. So I certainly won't like to write a biography. I think Dr. Manmohan Singh deserves a biography, but I think it'll be many years before somebody will actually produce a definitive biography of Dr. Manmohan Singh. I'm sure Mr. Modi deserves a biography. Mr. Modi has been ill-served by the books that have been published on him. They have been hagiographies. But at some stage, I hope somebody will actually write a good biography. Somebody is working on a biography of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But one of the problems when I spoke to the biographer, he said, the problem is kuch likhe nahi, sirf kavita likhe the. I mean, he didn't write much. I can only have poems that he wrote. You can't view a
That will still make for a wonderful book.
you can't view a biography out of poems. So yeah, but actually, Akshita, there is no shortage of people. I mean, I gave you two examples. I mean, Kamraj is one example. YB Chavan, in my view, a man who should have been prime minister at some point of time, but never became prime minister. Never. I mean, there is no biography of C. Subramaniam, a key figure in India's Green Revolution. Um, um, I hope at some point of time somebody will write a good scientific biography of Dr. Swaminathan, the great agricultural scientist. So, India is full of such people. At the national level, who have made an impact, people who have made an impact in the respective states where they have worked. So there is no shortage of subjects. But I think the important thing is to get the material, to get the sources, so that you can produce a good work of scholarship. And I slightly disagree with Mr. Kannan. I don't think only historians can produce. I think you can be a non-historian and yet aspire to produce a work of scholarship. Yes, I agree. Work of scholarship comes naturally to an S. Gopal. But Rajmohan was not a historian. I mean, Rajmohan was not an academic, but he produced first-rate works of scholarship.
Rohit, you want to come in?
Yeah, I will continue this idea that that Mr. Ramesh threw at us, and I'll take you to you, Vaibhav. But before going to you with the question, I think what Mr. Ramesh perhaps forgot is that Mr. Modi probably understands that nobody would be reading an academic biography. A few people would be reading a popular biography, but many more would be reading a comic. So if you're presenting a life story in a comic format, there will be more takers. So he probably understands that as a better format. But Vaibhav, taking the conversation forward, do you think now that the idea which is often ridiculed in the past, the third and a fourth front and so on, now that there is perhaps a stronger focus on the federal polity, smaller federal parties coming together, there are even conversations about maybe Ms. Mamata Banerjee leading the UPA and so on, do you think we would see more biographies of like a Mulayam Singh, like a like a Biju Patnaik, like somebody like a Goni Khan from Bengal, more biographies of regional leaders will come up as this divide between a national and a regional is sort of decimated over time, the way our politics is shaping up?
Undoubtedly, I'm sure. I mean, as I said, there have been very many figures who have made enormous impact in the states in which they have worked. And this is true of state after state. And these regional. I mean, I don't want the word region. There's some value-laden terms: national, regional. National is equal to good. Regional is equal to bad. So I don't want to use the word regional in a pejorative sense. When I use the word regional, I mean people whose karma bhumi has been one particular state or one particular region. Yes, I'm sure. I mean, we need it. These are people who require. Annadurai, for example, I would say that although he was a Tamil Nadu politician, He was a regional politician, but he did more for national unity than many other national politicians I can think of. So yeah, I mean these are people who should be known. I mean, I can think of at least 15 or 20 big names of the last 50, 60 years, who deserve political biography. Pratap Singh Kairon was a regional
Yes.
leader. He doesn't have a biography. Achyuta Menon, the best chief minister Kerala has ever had. There's no good biography of Achyuta Menon. I'm talking of English language. I mean, there are biographies in the regional language, but Mr. Kannan's point is very important. Biographies in regional languages very often end up being hagiographies.
Vaibhav, do you want to comment on that?
Uh,
I agree, Rohit, that we will increasingly see biographies of national as well as provincial figures. Again, provincial defined in terms of the area of one's activity and not one's outlook. So there will be, and there are, as and like Jairam Ramesh said, there is absolutely no shortage of uh, figures, important figures to write about. There is a serious shortage of biographies, in fact. So we will see in the future. I'm 100% sure. And I think one unfortunate thing, if I may refer to the fact, to refer to the past rather, is that biography as a category uh, did not enjoy too much legitimacy for a long time in various parts of the world, including India. I think gradually things are changing, and we're going through a period of churn at the moment. So some biographies may be good, some may be average, some may be purely hagiographic, some may be bad. But the fact that the churn is happening, I think, is a positive trend, and that would result ultimately and hopefully gradually in better biography. And why just politicians? There are writers who are essentially political writers. For instance, if you look at Vijay Tendulkar in Maharashtra, and he's an all India figure. His writings are essentially political. He suffered a lot of repression, and at the hands of the Shiv Sena and other forces in his own state. Somebody like him deserves a good biography. So that would also be very likely a political biography of a literary figure, maybe a literary biography as well as a political biography that reflects the politics of his time. Or someone like, since I'm speaking of Maharashtra at the moment,
I
say Prahlad Keshav, who played such a major role in Maharashtra in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and there would be figures across India, of similar stature. Maybe Karant in in another part of the India. So many figures across the country, and it's high time we highlighted these figures and what they have represented, and try to understand our past and also understand ourselves better through that past.
Yeah, I think the
just
challenge before us,
yes, Mr. Panneerselvan, go ahead.
Mr.
I think the challenge before us is to actually come up with a list of at least 100 people who have contributed towards an inclusive public sphere of modern India. And this inclusive public sphere of modern India covers too many areas: science, education. Say somebody like G. Parsarthi could have been in the advisor to the Prime Minister, first Vice Chancellor of JNU, interlocutor with the neighboring countries. How are we going to understand these personalities? Um, I think if we come up with at least 100 biographies of people who contribute. See, that's the reason I'm also very clear that I'm not going to use this word neutral. I'm consciously using of people who created inclusive public sphere. The moment we use editorial judgment, and editorial judgment is not a bad word. Editorial judgment helps us to filter certain things. Judgment does not permit us to conflate good and bad together in the name of false balancing. first thing as you have been trained as a journalist is deploy your editorial judgment and don't get sucked into false balancing or false equivalence. I don't get into false balancing. I don't get into false balancing. Once we get into that grid very clearly, I think we can bring out at least 100 crucial biographies. As he said, Mr. Ramesh said about C. Subramaniam. C. Subramaniam's the entire negotiation for PL 480 and the type of techniques he had to use with the Lyndon Johnson's administration to work it out is a big study. Guggen, the former bureaucrat and academic, as a part of Willy Brandt Commission. What was that experience? That is a very, very important one. Mr. Malcolm Aditya Shea from UNESCO coming back and as a vice chancellor and then establishing MIDS. These are all creating an inclusive public sphere for modern India. Therefore, once we have that idea very clearly entered in our mind, we can do this. I don't know who is going to fund it and also who is going to give us time. If somebody has to fund it and somebody has to give time, then I think each person can take up at least one or two big names and try to do the work.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Kannan, go ahead.
I think Paneer is very right. I mean, what is required is funding, because there are these figures that would make it in the market, because the market decides essentially whose biography should be written. It's not that I would very much like to do a biography of P. Jeevanandam, or for that matter Pasumpon Muthuramalinga in English. But would there be a market? So therefore we need funding. We can come up with a list of names, the makers of modern India and how they had contributed to it. That could be done. But this would not, if the market were to decide, and the market has decided so far, even Kamaraj would be a hard sell in English, I would say. Selling about 3,000 copies in English, you become a best-selling author. I mean, when I heard this, I was mortified. So, and in Tamil, in vernacular, you can only do about 4,000 copies. So the readership, despite the fact that these book fairs do bring in a lot of people and generate a lot of interest, the purchase of books, which also decides who should be written and what should be written, will continue to decide on who would be written.
Well, Mr.
I think that's a challenge also
if
any regional readers. Yes.
Were to be written, maybe the title should be "The Man Who Could Not Speak English But Yet Made India."
Could be very good. Very good. It has to be made attractive. Provocative.
But I believe.
So, Mr. Ramesh,
I believe Ram Guha is thinking of launching a series of biographies of modern Indian personalities. I mean, some talk that but I agree with you. You need a series. They can't be one-offs. And what Mr. Panneerselvan has said and what Mr. Kannan has also said, I think it requires funding. Of course, sometimes books can create their own markets by the manner in which you write and and of course in today's day everything is marketing. By the way the books are marketed. But there is a dearth for a series. I think there is a need for a series of makers of modern India. There's politicians, scientists, artists, literary personalities. The type that Vaibhav spoke about. It's not just politicians. It's not just political figures. These are public figures, public personalities. We don't have good scientific biographies in India, by the way. We do, except C.V. Raman and maybe Homi Bhabha. We have got, we don't have good biographies of scientists. Also, biographies need not be only of individuals. Biographies can be of institutions. Biographies can be of books. So, biography is not just necessarily or the biography of India. So biography is not just about individuals, They are also about ideas, they're also about ideologies, they're also about institutions.
Mr. Ramesh, just about 5 minutes to go. There are some questions also that have come in from people who've been listening in. Aishwarya has just put this question to you. It's a good one. How would Indira Gandhi have responded to the Hindutva challenge in the age of social media?
Sorry, how would she have responded to?
The Hindutva challenge in the age of social media.
Well, these counterfactual questions are always difficult to answer. Indira Gandhi was very comfortable going to the Ramakrishna mission, being photographed with the Sai Baba. She Rudraksh Mala. Great devotee of the Beirut Math. And by the way, the Hindutva elements in India are anti-Nehru. They are not anti-Indira Gandhi. Mr. Modi is deeply uncomfortable. He wants to obliterate the Nehruvian legacy, but he doesn't say a word against Indira Gandhi. But Indira Gandhi, obviously, what she did in 1971, broke up Pakistan. Didn't talk too much about secularism as her father did. So the Hindutva elements are comfortable with her. They're deeply uncomfortable about positively hate Jawaharlal.
There's someone called Sandhya who's joined us. Sandhya, can you just mute your audio, please? It's causing a bit of a disturbance in the discussion. Mr. Ramesh, one more question for you. What are your thoughts on political ideas and political practice? In what way are political leaders shaped by their advisors, staff, and friends?
Sorry, in what way political leaders are shaped by?
Their advisors, their staff, and their friends. He's followed that up with asking also if we can imagine a more complex idea of a political biography beyond a political leader. But I think you've spoken about that also.
Yeah, also I think, an advisor is only as good as the advisee. The fact that Indira Gandhi chose P.N. Haksar as her alter ego, as her intellectual advisor, speaks as much about Haksar as much as it speaks of Indira Gandhi. So I think, but there have been few such personalities in India have been few and far between. You really have to really identify them with great difficulty and build up their biography.
Okay, so we have a final, I think, from Rashmi. We'll conclude with that. Akshita, it's for all panelists, I think.
Yeah, this is a good question that I think is relevant for all our panelists because it talks about what really makes for a distinctive life in Indian politics. Political leadership is an intangible quality. What do panelists think makes these personalities larger than life besides what we know about them in the political domain? And I think all of you can easily answer that question. I'll start with Mr. Panneerselvan.
I think if leadership has contributed for transformation, then it's very, very important. And when I say the word transformation, I mean exactly what it. If there is such improved social indicators, if there is a definite progress, and if you're contributing for that, and one of the advantage of writing the posthumous biography is that you can actually evaluate the person. You are able to see their pluses and minuses, and if their pluses are bigger than the minuses, then that's it. They have contributed for the transformation of the society.
Mr. Kannan, having written about a larger-than-life personality like Dr. MGR, what would you say about this?
I think, amongst other things, it's how best they could capture the imagination of people. I think that is why, many have leadership qualities and leadership traits. Any number of people have them. What makes these people come up? This is a rat race. And what is it that makes them succeed? What is it that makes them resonate? There's so much to pick from. How does Mr. Modi emerge from this, and then how does Annadurai, beat the Congress monolith, a simple man who shows up, or MGR, who takes over a man considered to be much smarter and a born politician and a leader like Karunanidhi. So what is it? So that is what I think intrigues a biographer as well.
Vaibhav?
Yeah, I look at 2 or 3 questions when I select a subject. One is the person's position in public life and in public discourse. Is the person important enough? Number 2 is, would I really like to spend 3-4 years or perhaps more researching the person's life, or will the person bore me after a period of time? If I feel that the person would not hold my interest for too long, then the subject obviously is not chosen. So these are 2 extremely important things. And the third question, of course, is what any biographer would ask himself or herself is, am I qualified enough to write on the subject? So if I'm able to tick all these 3 boxes, then I'd go ahead. Otherwise, I wouldn't.
Okay. Mr. Jairam, Ramesh, being a politician yourself, you can perhaps speak not just as a biographer, but also from your political experience. What really makes politicians larger than life? And besides, what we really see, what hits us when you see them?
Well, it depends on their contributions. It depends on, what their work is. And that's why it's important to have a posthumous, look. Because, when you're doing things simultaneously, you don't get a sense of whether these contributions are enduring or not. So people who have made enduring contributions are people who are worth studying. Their lives are worth studying. So, of course, there have been people who have destroyed civilizations who have also been studied endlessly. Hitler and Stalin continue to be the subject of biographies. There's a biography of Mao, which I'm reading, a new biography of Mao. So, these are people who, who have had negative contributions in a sense. But yeah, you've got to have left an impact on your society, an enduring impact, and you then assess that impact, for its whether there are positive dimensions to that impact or negative dimensions to that impact.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of this session. Rohit, would you like to wrap this up?
You're muted.
Rohit, you're on mute. Yeah. Rohit, you're muted?
Okay. Hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I audible? Yes. Yeah. So, am I audible, right? Yeah. So thank you for all our attendees and our panelists, Mr. Panneerselvan, Mr. Kannan, Mr. Ramesh, and Vaibhav, and thank you, Akshita, for agreeing to co-host. It was a great panel. We hope to have many more discourses, if not on biographies, then definitely politics of the day. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much.
See you in another plenary somewhere.
Thank you, Akshita.
Thank you.